Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 8th of November, where we are discussing Dracula. So, in terms of Dracula, I had you watch the 1931 Universal Studios film, which has become so iconic. We see how Bela Lugosi, basically the lead, made that role his own. Interesting piece of trivia, he learned that role phonetically, English not being his first language. Hungarian born actor. So that's one of the reasons why we've got those stilted inflections. The first screen adaptation, though, of Dracula was an unlicensed bootleg version known as Nosferatu that came out in 1922 that you might be familiar with. It was very much in the vein of German Expressionism, using shadows beautifully. That's not to say that shadows also aren't used very well in the 1931 version. Initially, it started as a Broadway stage play, and some of the conventions from that stage play actually ended up being used in the film. For instance, the collar had a particular function in in Dracula's cape. There would have been a trapdoor in the stage play where the actor could have descended and that collar would have stayed upright through some wires, to kind of illustrate that Dracula was disappearing into thin air, or at least give that particular illusion. As we know, the film, as we've seen with other iconic Gothic films and just film in general, tends to make some rather significant adaptations based on many of the necessities of Hollywood. Sometimes that's about length, and certainly Dracula is a long text, so it needed to be condensed to fit into the average length of what a movie audience would expect. There are also economic concerns when you add additional characters. That means you need to pay actor salaries and wardrobe and all of that. So we see a lot of collapsing of the plot and the characters. And it's usually considered to be the first American horror film. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being usually given credit as the first horror film in the 1920s, and that was a German film. But Dracula is viewed as the first American film, and even though Frankenstein fell first in our chronology when we were reading Frankenstein, Dracula the film came out before the iconic Frankenstein film. And this film originally had no soundtrack, which gives it a very quiet and eerie sense to it. And certainly you probably noticed those majestic Gothic sets, and that's very much indicative of the Gothic tradition that we were talking about in terms of architecture. And the incredible amount of Christian imagery that exists within the text as well. The idea that Christianity is savior. And the film code demanded that the monster be destroyed at the ending of the film, which is exactly what we get. In other words, that Dracula, which can be read in a lot of different ways, including this invading foreigner. There's a good amount of xenophobia here. That needs to be conquered at the end, a kind of reverse imperialism, if you will. But before I start getting into some of the themes of the actual text itself, I thought I'd talk a little bit just about the novel in general. That in a stroke of brilliance, Bram Stoker decided to name his central character Dracula. Dracul being son of the devil, a cruel Romanian medieval conqueror who would impale his victims. And this is also somewhat reminiscent of a serial killer that came out in the 1500s, female, which is somewhat unusual, by the name of Countess Bathory, who's known to bathe in the blood of young girls. So you merge these two, this cruel medieval conqueror, and then also Countess Bathory and her obsession with blood being life, and then you get the inspiration for Dracula. As I had indicated, it was birthed in part through that very famous ghost story competition that Mary Shelley came up with her Frankenstein, but that Dr. Polidori, a member of the competition, came up with his short story, The Vampire, which we think also helped to inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. And there's lots of folklore associated with the idea of vampires. And actually, 1793 is one of the first recorded instances of vampirism in Vermont, no less. And there could be lots of explanations about the idea of vampirism, whether it's related to the fear of death that we were talking about early on with the Gothic and trying to find a way to have everlasting life, or the idea of tuberculosis mimicking many of the symptoms of vampirism, individuals becoming drained and lethargic and not having much energy. And we also talked about the possibility of premature burial when we were talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and that was a real possibility. So something like that could lead to the folklore tale of rising from the dead. And all of those, I think, are related to the idea of vampirism. And as long as this book is, I suggest that you can think of it as four separate texts. That might make it easier for you to be able to consume this text. I think of book one, the first four chapters or so. And this is when we are introduced to the vampire and Jonathan's story. And notice how the film made some difference, or made some changes by combining the characters of Jonathan and Renfield. But basically, I see that as establishing the setting or the mood. And then we shift into what's known, or what I am calling book two, where it's very much like a romance, and that's chapters 5 through 16. This is where we get Mina and Lucy's story and about their courtships and so forth. Book three, what I'm calling book three, this is what I would say is a mystery story with what's happening with Mina, and that's chapter 17 through 23. And you know that Edgar Allan Poe is credited with creating the modern day mystery story in the way that we think of it, so I think that's very applicable. And then lastly, what I call book four, it's basically an adventure story, a series of chase scenes, and that's in chapters 22 through 25. And I think that this was also very smart of Stoker, because by having these different sorts of genres embedded within Dracula, he could appeal to a much broader audience. So if you're interested in the supernatural, then chapters 1 through 4 are going to be of particular interest to you. If you are more of a romance novel person, then chances are chapters 5 through 16 and the questions of suitors would be of interest. If you like mystery stories, chapter 17 through 23, when they're trying to solve the mystery of what's happening to Mina, might be of appeal to you. And if you like action adventure, then chances are you would like the ending of the novel. That's chapters 22 to 25. And notice that this novel is written in the epistolary form, and that we get basically a series of letters as well as journal entries and newspaper clippings and so forth in order to be able to give us the story. And in fact, that's going to be important when we get to the ending of the novel, when the characters discuss what it means that they really don't have much in the way of hard evidence outside of a lot of journaling. And you've probably noticed that I've been trying to give you a little bit of extra time to read Dracula, because it is a long book. I thought what I would do is talk about the first half of the book today and then the second half of the book next class. In theory, we have a journal due next class. I certainly don't have any problems at all with giving you an extension on that, since I did give you a class off to work on your paper, which, by the way, I'm now reviewing and should be getting back to you, hopefully sooner rather than later, certainly before your second paper is due. It'll probably take me a little bit of time, because I will be evaluating based on not just content but also the writing, and I will put a letter grade on that as well as some suggestions. And if you are content with your letter grade, we can leave it at that. But if you wanted to earn a higher grade, you can all decide to write a revision if you'd like, incorporating my comments and suggestions. And if you need further direction, you can always make an appointment with me as well. And I just ask that you submit in the original evaluated copy along with your revision so I can compare the two. And you have up until the ending of the semester to do that, but obviously the sooner the better for everybody involved. But we'll talk a little bit more about the paper as I begin to get those back to you. So in terms of the novel Dracula, it actually was even longer than what we experience. Stoker's editor had suggested that he try to condense it by deleting a chapter, and that chapter was deleted, and then it was released as a short story entitled Dracula's Guest, which you can read as an independent short story. Not that you're required to, but you can see in the notes below under chapter 1 in the third section, I've indicated where you can access Dracula's Guest, the link for that. And some of the things that I wanted you to pay attention to in that first chapter is the importance of technology and modernization, at least for that particular time period in the 1800s. We get references to things like shorthand and typewriters and telegraphs. And again, this is supposed to be an example of the progress of the times, represented by the Western civilized world, which is going to be in contrast with Dracula's world in Romania and Transylvania, which is supposed to be the uncivilized. The East is basically irrational and filled with superstition. But what we will find out is that the West, even though it claims it's rational and scientific, it also needs to embrace the irrational and the superstitious. And that's something that the Van Helsing character does in Dracula, and that he's able to embrace both worlds. The worlds of science, because he's a doctor, but also the world of religion and superstition. Notice that when we move to Dracula's area in the east, the trains don't run on time. Again, that little detail is just supposed to indicate how basically there's a lack of civilization. And Jonathan Harker is going there for a real estate transaction. He represents Britain. Note his last name, Harker, to listen. And he's told at the very beginning not to go to Dracula's castle. Of course, he dismisses it, thinking that it's all superstition. And of course, it's not superstition, as we find out. And I had suggested earlier that Dracula is oftentimes read as a symbol of that which is foreign or that which is alien. And the threat of the foreign or the alien coming to the, quote, civilized, unquote, world. In other words, the West. In other words, Britain. And basically attacking the British way of life. So there's a lot of xenophobia that can be read in this text. I think it also is read as a parable about communicable diseases. And certainly at the time, we talked a little bit about the repressive Victorian period and how venereal disease was running rampant. There certainly is a sexual element that's quite evident when you are reading Dracula, perhaps less so when you're watching a film adaptation, depending on the film adaptation that you happen to be watching. But the bite is oftentimes seen as very phallic because it is penetrating. And also the idea of the exchange of blood, which could happen with the taking of a woman's virginity. So all of that was embedded within the text. And it also strikes me that the folklore associated with bats and our current virus, and how there is at least speculation that the way that it originated was through a bat, it strikes me as having some rather contemporary and interesting parallels with our current day. Note when you're reading the book all of the references to eating and appetite, and these are not merely just filler details. The idea that the vampire feeds on individuals, it has constant appetite that cannot be in any way satisfied. And also think about the idea of eating and gluttony, as well as the idea of perhaps going to excess, and we'll see all of that embedded in the text. So in the first page, where there's a small dinner reference, again, it's more than just filler. It's reinforcing the theme of eating and the theme of appetite. And the setting, which is May 4th, but that is, even though we think of spring, that's St. George's Day, and this is supposed to be a day that, at least from the pagan tradition, is when evil things hold sway. So that setting is a very appropriate setting for this Gothic text. And again, we've got that Gothic atmosphere with Frankenstein's castle. Notice the castle doesn't have a bell or a knocker. We talked a little bit about this as well when we were talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and his residence, the idea of being in isolation, and we know that isolation is always a negative thing in the Gothic. The castle is on the edge of a precipice, and of course, anybody who enters that castle is both literally and figuratively on the edge of a precipice, as we see when Jonathan is there. the setting of night, and of course Transylvania, which has become synonymous with vampire. And even think about some modern day ways that we can think of vampires, about a psychic vampire who basically eats or lives off of the life force of someone else. So note that when Jonathan visits First Dracula, he sees that there is a library full of English books. And basically, Dracula is trying to assimilate himself and acculturate himself to British society so that he can invade it. He wants to buy British real estate. And again, as I said, this is oftentimes read as a fear of immigration, about what happens when foreign cultures come, particularly once they mix with the females of the culture and basically have diluted and in some ways tainted bloodlines. Chapter 3 is where we get Jonathan's imprisonment. And there also is some great reference to sexuality when Jonathan is, quote, attacked by the 3 female vampires. And I'll go through that quotation and some of the others in the next class. But it very much can be seen as an episode of oral sex. And Jonathan is quite passive here. The idea that in a repressive Victorian society, he would never be tempted. But of course, if he is overcome by the forces of evil, then he is not necessarily at fault for any temptation that might occur. Chapter 4 is where we get Dracula actually trying to take on Jonathan's persona. He puts on Jonathan's clothing, actually, and begins to go out and post letters, again, trying to fool Jonathan's family and friends by posting letters that he's fine. But at any rate, this idea of wearing Jonathan's clothing is oftentimes used as a symbol where Dracula himself is trying to take on the persona of Jonathan and the British in general. And then chapter 4 ends with a cliffhanger. Again, very common technique in contemporary times, less so during this time, where we want to know what's going to happen with Jonathan. Is he going to survive? And then we completely shift to another story to keep us on the edge of our seats. And this is where we have the shift from journals to ultimately letters. And it might strike you as odd that the characters spend so much time writing to one another. Unless, again, you want to think about contemporary times and the ways we tend to communicate on social media, and then maybe it wouldn't seem so odd at all. Just like scrapbooking at the time was very common, and I guess Pinterest at this time is quite common, and they both share lots of characteristics. So we shift from Jonathan to the 2 females, Mina and Lucy, who in some ways are complete opposites. Mina is supposed to represent the modern woman. She is able to use a typewriter. She knows shorthand. She knows stenography. But in context of being a modern woman, she wants to be useful to her man, to Jonathan in this particular instance. Lucy is a modern woman in the sense that she has 3 suitors at the same time. And she is, of course, a very traditional female because she's only concerned with romance. But she is an unusual female in that she contemplates how nice it would be to have all 3 at the same time. Notice how 3 is a number that's oftentimes repeated in Dracula. This idea of the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, because Christianity plays such a role in there. And one might say that Lucy is a bit loose, and she's aptly named with her morals if she is contemplating 3 suitors. We're also introduced to Quincy Morris, who is an American. He's a Texan, and he is a foreigner. And spoiler alert, Quincy is killed at the end, and I don't think it's accidental that he, the foreigner, is killed. Just like I don't think it's accidental that Lucy, the one who might be a bit loose in her morals, is killed. Dr. Seward is introduced. He happens to be running the sanitarium. He's supposed to represent the professional world. And then Arthur Holmwood, who's supposed to represent the aristocracy. Note that Lucy is wooed by all 3. The Quincy Morris, American Texan, the Dr. Seward, professional British, and the Arthur Holmwood, aristocratic British. And notice who she chooses, the aristocratic Brit. Again, you might say that this is perhaps in some ways less about romance and more about finding an appropriate match. Renfield, who's become quite famous because of his ridiculous behavior and his, as Stephen King would call it, elements of gross out. The idea that he's consuming insects. And of course, this entire novel is about consumption, consuming the life force of others. Obviously, it's a lower level life force, and Renfield goes to the lower level life force. And the suggestion is that does Dracula see humans, and particularly British, as a lower level life force? There's also a good amount of punning in this text. So look for puns like count. For instance, characters saying that you can count on me because obviously Dracula is a count. And another way he oftentimes read is that he is this aristocratic, affluent individual who's living off of the labor of the masses, sucking their lifeblood, so to speak. In chapter 6, we find out that Lucy is spending time at the grave of a suicide. Not a good idea, particularly because that's considered to be unhallowed land. Suicide being the only sin, according to Christianity, that cannot be forgiven. It's one of the reasons why Dracula is able to attack at that particular place. And we see Renfield and his gross out, so to speak, with his consumption of insects. The idea is that Renfield is being manipulated through Dracula. And then in chapter 7, again, references to things like scrapbooking, and this is where they're beginning to collect some of the evidence and data. And we learn about the Demeter ship arrival. Happens to be one of my favorite scenes, the idea that a ship captain is beginning to lose members of his ship. In the middle of the night, it turns out that they are carrying, unbeknownst to them, Dracula's coffin. And in the middle of the night, Dracula is coming out and consuming the members of the ship. And that image with the ship captain sort of being alone and tying his hands to the wheel with a set of rosary beads, I've always found particularly eerie. But the ship is named Demeter, and notice the commonality with the word of demented. And then as we move forward and we find out that Dracula has basically found a way to be able to transport himself from Transylvania into England. This is where we're going to begin to get the submergings of plots. In chapter 8, there's lots of references not just to appetite, but to women's appetite. And in fact, there's even a reference that a woman should be able to basically see her spouse asleep before their marriage, which suggests premature sex, or at least premarital sex, I should say. Again, puns like saying you don't count now. Again, when Renfield says that, of course, reference to the count. Chapter 9 is when we are introduced to Van Helsing, a man who embraces science but also embraces religion. We'll see this in The Exorcist as well when we are introduced to one of the exorcists, actually both of them, Father Merrin and Father Karras. And we also learn a little bit about how Dr. Seward is connected with Van Helsing, that in the past they knew one another, and Seward actually sucked poison from a wound that Van Helsing had. Again, this idea of sucking, and which is what you see in vampirism, and of course sucking can also be quite erotic as well. Chapters 10 through 12, this is one of the ways that we have to suspend some disbelief. This is where the men in Lucy's life are basically giving her blood transfusions. She's being depleted, and they're not quite sure how or why. We find out that basically she's been a victim of Dracula's. That said, if you know anything about blood transfusions, you just can't willy-nilly accept any blood transfusion. You have to have a match. But of course, the science here is something that we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief with. It's one of the things that I admire about Mary Shelley, as I had indicated when she was talking about Frankenstein, in that she didn't give us too much of the science so that it isn't something that could be disputed at a later date. And when we get to chapter 12, this is where Quincy, and we get a little bit of foreshadowing here, he shoots a vampire bat. And we also see how Quincy is rather rash, a statement here that perhaps Americans themselves are rather rash as compared to the calmer and more temperate Brits. And this is where we have Lucy's, quote, death, unquote. But of course, we find out that she's only physically dead because she's been the victim of a vampire, that ultimately she will rise up again into everlasting life, unless she is killed properly. And in chapter 13, we get a very small reference from Mina at this particular point in time. Basically, Jonathan has been able to make his way back from Transylvania and return to Mina and Britain. And as Mina responds when she's out with Jonathan, that she thought it was kind of improper for her and her husband to be holding hands and arms in public, which goes to show the level of decorum during Victorian times, and also goes to show as well the level of repression during Victorian times. And Seward says a very interesting comment about Quincy. Remember our Texan. Dr. Seward says that if America can keep breeding men like Quincy, it will be a world power. And I think that in some ways this is a commentary from some of the fears about a rising America and what America might be able to bring to the world order. Chapter 14 is when Van Helsing talks about his rather lonely life. Again, we know isolation is a bad thing in the Gothic. And he talks about how grateful he is to be able to have this new sense of community with all of them. And then in chapters 15 to 16 is where we get the men who ultimately have to kill Lucy. And Stephen King talks about this in Danse Macabre, actually, where the scene seems very orgasmic when the stake actually is driven into her. The stake could be seen as a phallic symbol. And then, of course, all of the contortions of the body that happen after that. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the things to look for, or some of the things to look at in the first section of the text. I thought what I would do is next class talk about the second section of the text, and then also direct you to some quotation that I think would be relevant. And again, the idea is that in theory, you would have a journal due, but you could certainly take additional time because I slowed us up a little bit by giving you a day off for being able to work on your paper. And as you can see in the notes below, this is the last section of the notes. That paper number 1 should have been submitted at this point. So I am working on it, and I'm working on getting that back to you. So for today's attendance question, because I'm quite aware that you are probably still working your way through Dracula, the longest text of the semester, the good news is that the reading load lightens considerably after Dracula. So that's something that you can look forward to. For today's attendance question, which would be due on Tuesday, November 9th at 8 a.m., thus far in your reading of Dracula, do you like or dislike the novel Dracula, and why? Do you like or dislike the novel Dracula, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and next class we will continue discussing Dracula. Take care. Bye-bye.